So we should get used to significantly higher inflation for the next several years than we have had in the Western world for the last 40. And it's going to last at least 6 years, maybe as many as 8, and that assumes we get started pretty soon. As the world has aged demographically, capital has been available at greater volumes with greater ease at lower rates than any time in human history, and that pretty much defines the last 15, 20 years. And now the people who generated all that capital, the baby boomers as they were moving towards retirement, are moving into retirement. And so the capital costs were always going to skyrocket about right now and continue rising at least into the mid-2030s. We have 15, 20 years of incredibly cheap capital that we now have to process through. And if you look at just the raw data, the United States is okay. We seem to have at least learned most of the lesson from the 2008 financial crisis, but Australia hasn't. Australian credit has risen by a factor of 7 since the year 2000. In the case of India, you're talking about 14. In the case of China, you're talking 34. So the idea that we can kind of let the air out of some of these financial bubbles without them popping is probably a bit of a stretch. Well, I would start by saying that the United States banking sector tends to be among the more healthy ones in the world. And if half of our banks really are insolvent, we're all screwed and it doesn't matter what you do. I happen to not believe that report at all. The idea that there's a lot of stress in the banking sector, that's obviously true. But let me dial this back a little bit and put a couple of things into context. Think about what tech is. Think about what Silicon Valley is. The whole idea is you put a bunch of 20 and 30 somethings into a network if they're not physically in contact with one another, and you pay them to think up things that don't exist. And then you pay them more to figure out how to make those things exist. And then you pay them more to prototype those technologies and even more to operationalize them. And only then do you start building them out throughout society. You don't get money back from any of that. That is all done on credit. And so you have to have a financial system that is deep, that is liquid, and finance has to be easy to come by and above all cheap. And that is exactly the environment we have been in the United States since roughly 1995, largely because the baby boomers have been nearing retirement, but haven't reached retirement yet. What changed last year is we hit majority retirement for the baby boomers. And we've always known that this was coming. We've always known that that money was going away, and now most of it has. And so as a result, we've seen the steepest increase in capital costs in the history of my country. And lo and behold, Silicon Valley got hammered. We won't see the same pace of technological advancement again until such time as we have cheap capital again. That will not happen until we have a new mature worker generation that has not yet retired. That will be the millennials in the 2030s and 40s. We have had 4 banks in the United States go bust. Every single one of them was affiliated with the tech sector. That's to be expected. The fact that only 4 went bust is actually kind of a surprise to me. And if you look at the wider economy, the sharpest increase in capital costs we've ever had, not one went bust. Is everyone under stress? Sure, you can't change capital costs that suddenly without stress. But as Donald Rumsfeld used to say, that's a known. This is what the Federal Reserve was built to deal with, and it has tools for this. Does that mean other banks aren't going to go? Not what I'm saying. I'm saying at this point in the cycle, or super cycle, which is probably a more appropriate term here, the damage really is held to just a couple of sectors, with tech at the top of the list, real estate's probably second. So far, purchasing power is holding up, consumer activity is holding up, property prices are mostly holding up. I don't want to say a recession is impossible in my country, but so far, things look okay. Well, let me start by saying I never want the Federal Reserve's job, so I'm not going to be one of those armchair pundits who questions their every motion, because I don't think I could do better. I will say that most of the reduction in inflation that we have seen to this point is probably not actually due to the Fed. It's because we're now quite a ways past COVID. Remember that from roughly 2020 until mid-2021, we were having significant whiplashes in demand globally. Every time we got a new variant, every time we got a new vaccine policy, every time something changed, what we consumed, the patterns shifted. And it took about 18 months with each shift for industry to change the manufacturing supply chains to catch up. Well, in the United States, Texas, Arizona, and Florida, they opened up mid-year, and then a few months later, everyone but California followed suit. And then California followed in February of 2022. So yes, those are the dates. Well, we're 18 months past that. So the supply chains have caught up. And so the supply-driven inflation has gone down. That's probably responsible for half of the shift in inflation. The half that hasn't gone away, that's ultimately rooted in labor. Because remember, the baby boomers, the largest generation we've ever had, the largest worker class we've ever had, is now half retired. So the Federal Reserve is using the tool that it has for the problem it understands, but there's a big lag because the sort of demand that is being crunched here is not what has actually driven inflation to this point. If we're going to solve the inflation problem in the long run, we have to fix the supply system. That means training up workers to be more productive. That means a degree of automation, but we have to do that in an environment with more expensive capital, not just because of the Fed, but because of what's going on with the baby boomer retirement. And that's before you consider in disruptions that might happen in places like Germany because of the war, or China because of its demographic collapse. So we've got a lot of headwinds coming that hit the core of what supplies us with goods. And the only way to get around that is produce more goods elsewhere, and that means building more industrial plant, and that is also inflationary. So we should get used to significantly higher inflation for the next several years than we have had in the Western world for the last 40. And it's going to last at least 6 years, maybe as many as 8, and that assumes we get started pretty soon. It doesn't matter who's president, the government is always going to do a degree of spin to help people or to try to get people to not panic. I think to the degree that the governments of the world understand the problem is in some question in my mind. But the biggest concern that I have is we are radically unprepared for China exiting the manufacturing business. Demographically speaking, their labor costs have gone up now by a factor of 16 since 2020. They're no longer the low-cost producer of anything. And the demographic situation is now so atrocious that they're literally running out of people aged 40 to be in the factories in the first place. And that's before you consider perhaps an energy shock because of the Ukraine war or trade shock because of tensions with the United States. We're going to lose them, and we are not ready for that. Central bank digital currencies mean something different to everyone, and in the most extreme version, which is what the Chinese are trying to implement, some version of what you just outlined actually is the express government goal, the ability to monitor in real time every transaction everywhere. But keep in mind the very big difference between the American system and the Chinese system. The American Federal Reserve is just a few hundred people, and they have no interest in monitoring transactions, and they have no capacity without at least 100-fold expansion in their staff. China has 1.3 billion people, and government control of everyone's daily life is the first and foremost goal of the Chinese Communist Party. So for one of these governments, a digital currency is expressly designed to do exactly what you said. And in the other case, with the Federal Reserve isn't even sure it wants one. The Federal Reserve is poking at it, but it doesn't at the moment see a very strong use case for an independent digital currency. Now, if you talk about a digital currency as what the Fed is actually doing, which is just basically making all transactions that want to be digital, and you use paper to cash as rarely as possible, and everything is cleared on your phone, then yes, the Federal Reserve is going that direction, but the United Kingdom is already there because the United Kingdom basically got rid of paper checks. So there's a natural evolution here in the financial system that the Fed is embracing. But what most people talk about when they're talking about CDBs is really not what the Western world is even exploring, much less has an interest in.